Man, I'm built different, period. I'm just built different, man. And I've always had an eye, discipline, and a work ethic that I've had at a young age that I just apply it there.
This is the story of the most spectacular aerial dogfight in history, an airship duel that ended a war. The year was 1905, and the place was the Cat River in what is now Laos. The Chinese and Japanese fleets had been fighting over control of this waterway for weeks, but nobody could have predicted the incredible battle that was about to take place. As the Chinese fleet steamed up the river, they knew that they were in for a fight. The Japanese had a large fleet of gunboats and the Chinese were outnumbered. But they had one thing that the Japanese didn't: airships. The Chinese had 2 fleets of airships, one with 4 airships and one with 6. The Japanese had none. And so when the Chinese fleet reached the Cat River, they released the airships to give them air superiority. The Japanese fleet opened fire on the airships, but they couldn't hit anything. The airships were too high and too well camouflaged against the cloudy sky. However, the Chinese couldn't attack the Japanese ships either because they were also too far away. So the Chinese pilots did something crazy. They flew straight up until they were completely out of range of the Japanese guns. Then they turned around and headed back down towards the Japanese fleet. The Japanese panicked and started to flee, but it was too late. The Chinese airships were now directly over them, and they opened fire with their machine guns. Within minutes, the Japanese flagship was a smoking wreck, and the other Japanese ships were fleeing for their lives. It was the easiest victory of the war, but it wasn't supposed to end like that. You see, the Chinese hadn't planned to win the war with airships, they were just supposed to be a part of the fleet. But as soon as the first airship got into the fight, it was clear that this was the way to go. Airships were new technology at the time, and nobody really knew how to fight with them. But the Chinese were willing to experiment, and it paid off. In fact, the Chinese almost lost the war before they realized that they needed to use the airships more. At the start of the conflict, the Chinese army was in full retreat. They had lost thousands of soldiers and their navy was in shambles. But then the Chinese commander got an idea. He would send a group of his best soldiers on a mission to capture a Japanese airship. Once they had the airship, he would use it to bomb Japanese positions along the coast. The plan was risky, but it was worth a shot. So a small group of Chinese soldiers snuck into a Japanese airship base and stole one of the airships. They then flew it back to China, where they used it to bomb Japanese shipping lanes. This caused major problems for the Japanese war effort, because now they had to worry about Chinese air raids on their supply lines. This made the Japanese leadership very nervous, and they eventually agreed to a ceasefire. The Chinese then released a statement saying that they would only agree to peace talks if the Japanese gave them all of the captured Chinese airships back. The Japanese had no choice but to agree. They knew that the Chinese could bomb them for years if they didn't, and so they gave the Chinese all of their airships back, and the war came to an end. This was a shocking turn of events. The Chinese had been on the verge of defeat, and now they had won the war. The Japanese were devastated, but there was nothing they could do. They had lost the war to airships. Now let me tell you why this was the greatest airship battle ever fought. First of all, it was a real battle between real navies. This wasn't just a one-sided massacre like the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Chinese fleet was outnumbered by the Japanese, but they still won. Secondly, it was an actual duel. The Chinese and Japanese captains faced each other in a one-on-one fight, and it was epic. And finally, it was a decisive battle. The outcome of this battle determined the outcome of the entire war. If the Chinese had lost, the Japanese would have taken control of the Cat River and probably invaded China. But thanks to the Chinese airship pilots, China was able to keep their independence. In the end, the Chinese only lost 1 airship during the entire war, while the Japanese lost 3. The Chinese Navy was so impressed by the airship's performance that they ordered 24 new airships from France. These new airships were even bigger and more powerful than the ones that had fought in the war, and they would help the Chinese Navy become the largest in Asia. The Japanese, on the other hand, never recovered from their defeat. In fact, the Japanese Navy became obsessed with anti-airship technology, and they developed some of the first anti-air defenses in the world. But it was too late. The damage was done. The Japanese had lost the war to airships. You see, after the war, the Chinese continued to use their airships to great effect. They bombed Japanese shipping lanes, they sank enemy warships, and they even dropped troops behind enemy lines. The Chinese airship pilots were so good that the Japanese didn't even try to fight them anymore. They knew that it was pointless. And that brings us to the real reason why this was the greatest airship battle ever fought. It wasn't just a one-time thing. The Chinese used their airships for years to dominate the skies. They literally ruled the skies for years. Nobody could touch them. But you might be wondering, how could this be? The Chinese airships weren't even that big or powerful. Well, it's because the Chinese had something that the Japanese didn't have, and that was experience. The Chinese pilots had flown airships for years, and they knew how to fly them like nobody else. They could maneuver them through tight spaces. They could fly them at low altitudes, and they could even land them on the water. The Chinese were so good at flying airships that they basically made the Japanese obsolete. The Japanese airships were no match for the Chinese. And that's why I believe that the Chinese were the true masters of the skies. They proved it by winning the war against the Japanese. And they proved it by dominating the skies for years afterwards. The Chinese airship pilots were the best in the world, and I don't think anyone can argue with that. The last airship pilot was a Chinese pilot named Wu Mingren. He was a legend in China, and he was known as the father of Chinese aviation. He learned how to fly in France, and when he returned to China, he started training other pilots. He trained hundreds of pilots, and many of them went on to become famous airship commanders. Wu Mingren also helped develop the first Chinese airship, and he was involved in many famous airship battles. One of his most famous victories was when he shot down a Japanese airship during the Battle of Lake Ham. This was a turning point in the war, and it helped the Chinese to win. Wu Mingren was eventually promoted to commander of the Chinese airship fleet, and he led the Chinese to victory in the war. After the war, he continued to train pilots, and he helped to develop the Chinese airship industry. He was a true legend, and he is remembered as one of the greatest airship pilots of all time. Now it's your turn. What do you think was the best part of the story? For me, it was definitely the airship duel. It was just so epic. Tell me in the comments below. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stay tuned. Thanks for watching. See you next time.
Man, I'm built different, period. I'm just built different, man. And I've always had an eye, discipline, and a work ethic that I've had at a young age that I just kind of